The first thing Yoko became aware of was the light. Not the warmth of light, not sunlight, filtering through curtains the way it did in her apartment on Tuesdays, when she forgot to close the blinds. This light was a clinical pulse, a flicker at the edge of perceptible. The kind that made the eyes ache without knowing why. The ceiling above her was low and white. The room smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it. Something older and wetter, like the inside of a mouth. She tried to sit up and found she couldn't. The restraints were not rough. That was the first wrongness. They were soft. Padded at the wrists and ankles with a material that felt almost expensive. As if whatever held her here cared about the quality of her captivity. She turned her head. The wall to her left held an aquarium. In the tank, eels moved through the dark water, with a boneless patience that made her stomach contract. The wall to her right was bare plaster. There was a camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, a small red light burning steadily beneath the lens. The camera was watching her. She said, "Hello," and the word came out thin and felt immediately stupid in the still air. Nobody answered. The eels moved, the light pulsed. Later, she had no sense of how much later the door opened. Two figures in white. A man, tall, with the kind of face that was handsome in a way that made her feel vaguely ill, cheekbones that seemed designed rather than born, and a woman, shorter, her dark hair pinned back, her eyes doing something complicated that Yoko could not read. They moved her toward her with the specific choreography of people who had entered rooms like this before, who knew where to stand, so that neither of them blocked the camera's line of sight. The man introduced himself as Dr. Katayama. He said it the way people say things they have said many thousands of times. Perfectly, and without meaning any of it. "You were very sick," he told her. "You collapsed." "Sure, sister bro." The woman, who smiled when he said sister, a brief tight smile, the kind that corrects a fact without saying anything, reached out and touched Yoko's hand. Touch was wrong, in the same way the restraints were wrong. Too calibrated, caring in the way that a performance of caring is careful. "I want to go home," Yoko said. "Course you do," the man said. "And you will first. We need to help you." She looked at the camera. She looked at the eels. She looked at the man's face, which was still doing its work of being handsome, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, not yet. Something quieter than panic. A recognition. The specific stillness that comes when the body understands something before the mind is willing to. She thought, "I am not in a hospital." She did not say it. She lay there and watched the camera and waited, 312 light-years away. Though distance for them was a courtesy concept rather than a lived experience. The architect cast of the Vel were completing the 47th century of what they called the survey. The survey had no particular translation equivalent in any human language. Its closest approximation was something between cartography and consumption, a slow, methodical passage through inhabited space, cataloging the minds they found there, sampling those worth sampling, discarding the rest. They had been doing it longer than humanity had been building fires. They would continue doing it after the sun, that warmed the third planet of this unremarkable yellow star, had exhausted itself and gone cold. The L did not have bodies in any sense that Yoko would have recognized. They were arrangements. Vast, distributed, self-modifying architectures of neural substrate that had shed biological form before life on Earth had evolved past single cells. They retained from that original biology was an appetite, the need to consume, to process, to categorize and file. They had simply scaled it. The species they had cataloged numbered, now in the tens of thousands. Most were simple. Pattern recognition, rudimentary tool use, basic social bonding. The Vel filed them under categories that translated, roughly, as useful, interesting, edible, metaphorically. The Vel did not eat in the conventional sense, though what they did to minds they found compelling was not entirely unlike it, and irrelevant. Humans were initially filed under interesting. The survey teams assigned to this arm of the galaxy had sent a scout tendril to Earth, approximately 40 Earth years, before Yoko woke up in her room with the eels. They had observed with some fascination the species' tendency towards self-destruction, its inexplicable persistence in continuing anyway, its strange habit of manufacturing narrative out of random events, of insisting that chaos meant something. They found the emotional architecture of human brains particularly compelling. The way memory and imagination occupied the same neural real estate, so that humans lived in a permanent state of interference between what was and what might be. It made their inner worlds extraordinarily rich. It also made them, the VL had discovered, very difficult to model. The survey used a specific methodology. When they wanted to understand a mind, they entered it. This was not metaphorical. A scout tendril of VL substrate, reduced to near microscopic scale, could infiltrate a biological nervous system and read it from the inside, sampling the architecture, mapping the associations, testing the load tolerances. They had done this to 43 humans so far. The humans they selected never knew what had happened. They simply woke one morning with a headache. They couldn't explain and went about their lives. While the VEL filed their data, Yoko was number 44. She had been selected for a specific reason. The VEL's preliminary models had flagged something in her neural signature that did not match their predictive frameworks. An anomaly. A region of the brain, primarily her right hemisphere, the clusters that handled pattern recognition and spatial reasoning, that seemed to operate outside the statistical envelope they had established for the species. Pathological, unusual. The way a particular crystal is unusual when it refracts light in directions the other crystals around don't. They wanted a closer look. What the VEL did not fully understand, what they had never needed to understand about any species they had cataloged, was the difference between a mind that was unusual and a mind that was aware of being unusual. They were used to subjects who did not know they were being read, who lay still in the dark and did not wonder about the light. Yoko was still in the dark and wondering about everything. On the second day, she had started counting by the meals, which came twice, which she ate because not eating would not help her. She began to notice the seams, not physical seams, the seams in the performance. The man who called himself Katayama was good. His gestures were right. The way he tilted his head when he listened, the slight forward lean that signaled concern, the practiced gravity around his eyes when he said anything meant to be reassuring. He was good the way a very skilled mimic is good. The underlying logic of him was wrong. When he asked her questions about her childhood, her dreams, her earliest memories of learning to read, his interest was not in her answers, but in her responses to answering. He was watching the inside of her, and the face was cover. The woman was less careful. She slipped, sometimes, into moments of boredom that were almost physical. A flicker in the eyes, a barely perceptible settling of the shoulders. She was the assistant in the relationship, which meant she had been given the less interesting work, monitoring, adjusting, maintaining the fiction. When it threatened to come apart, she was competent at it. She was not interested in it. On the third day, they sedated Yoko. She woke with a burning at the back of her skull and the certainty, vertiginous and absolute, that something had been inside her head. Not a surgical certainty, not pain exactly, but a wrongness in the quality of her thoughts, a subtle drag, like a search drawer left not quite properly closed. She lay very still and did not show that she knew. This was the most important decision she had made in her life, though she did not yet know that. She thought about what she knew. She knew the room. She knew the camera, which was always on. She knew the aquarium, which she had come to understand was not decoration. The eels watched her in the way that cameras watch, with a specific directionality. She knew that Katayama and the woman followed a schedule. The door opened at intervals she could feel becoming predictable. She knew the restraints were padded, but not sophisticated. She knew she had been fed twice per day, which meant someone was invested in keeping her functional. She thought, something wants me alive and thinking clearly. She thought, that is a weapon. She thought about her grandmother who had raised silkworms, who had told her once that the worm does not know what it is making. It makes the silk because it is silk, because the making is native to it, because there is no distance between what it is and what it does. grandmother had said this, while watching the worms work and smiling in that private way she had, the smile that meant, "And isn't that something?" Yoko had been 8. She had not understood. She understood now. Whatever was inside her head, whatever kept visiting, kept reading her, did not know what it was touching, could not. That was the seam. The mirror they held up to study her reflection did not know that she could see it holding the mirror. She began very quietly to prepare. The Vel architect designated Survey 7 had been running the Earth project for 11 of the planet's years. In Vel terms, this was a brief engagement, a short-form study meant to produce a simple classification output, interesting or useful or edible or irrelevant. 4 categories: clean. Subject 44 was not producing clean output. The neural mapping of Subject 44 was, Survey 7 had filed in its initial report, the most architecturally complex organic mind it had encountered in its 47 centuries of operation. This was stated as a factual matter, without valuation. Complex did not mean better. It meant harder to model. It meant the categories blurred. The anomaly was in the interference between memory and imagination. In most humans, this interference was passive. The two systems contaminated each other in ways the subject couldn't control, producing what humans called confabulation, dream work, creativity. In Subject 44, the interference was not passive. It appeared to be voluntary. She seemed able to run the two systems simultaneously, deliberately, producing a kind of active overlay, using imagination to predict and map reality in real time, using memory to test those predictions against evidence, cycling between them at a speed Survey 7's models had not accounted for. In simpler terms, she thought the way the Vel processed, not the content, the architecture. Survey 7 filed this under anomaly, flagged it for architect review, and authorized a deeper reading. This required a longer contact duration, which required the biological interface to remain viable and cooperative. Hence, the room, the doctor, the woman, the performance of care. Survey 7 did not consider that the subject might be aware of being read. It had never had to consider this. In 47 centuries of survey work, no biological mind had detected the presence of a Vel tendril in its neural substrate. The tendrils were too small. The contact was too subtle. The subjects were categorically not the kind of things that noticed. The thing that Survey 7 did not have a category for was what a mind does when it is so good at noticing that it notices even the things designed to be unnoticeable. On the 4th day, Yoko let them see that she was afraid. Not her actual fear, which was real and deep and lived in her chest like a stone, but a performance of fear, a shallow, visible fear, the kind they would expect. She let herself tremble when Katayama entered. She let her voice crack when she asked about her sister. She cried, once, in a way that required very precise control. Enough to look genuine, not enough to be incapacitating, because she needed her eyes clear and her hands still. The woman watched her with something that almost resolved into pity. Almost. Under it was something colder and more clinical which Yoko filed away. The woman was the instrument. Tayama was the face. Whatever was behind the face was neither of them, and was using them both. That night, she thought it was night. The light in the room dimmed at intervals she'd mapped. She worked the restraint on her right wrist, not to free herself, not yet. She worked it because she needed to know exactly how it functioned. The mechanism, the tolerances, the specific point at which it would give. She worked it for 40 minutes, and then stopped and lay still and kept her breathing even. She knew the mechanism. She thought about her grandmother's silkworms. She thought about the fact that the worm doesn't know it's making silk. But the silk knows what it is. She thought, let them read me. Let them read everything they want. I will give them everything they want to find. The veal do not experience emotions in any way that maps to the human emotional register. Experience is closer to states of processing. High engagement, low engagement, anomalous flag, resolution. Over 47 centuries, Survey 7 had developed a very faint preference for anomalous flag, the category that meant something unexpected, in the way that a system which has processed the same input for millennia might develop something very like hunger for the thing it has not yet seen. Subject 44 was producing anomalous flag outputs at a rate that Survey 7 had not encountered in any previous subject. Memory structures were vast. Imagination overlays were faster than Survey 7 had thought, biologically, possible. What was producing the high engagement flag was something else entirely. There was a region of activity in her prefrontal cortex that Survey 7 could not map. Not because it was dormant, it was extremely active. It was producing a pattern that did not correspond to any function in Survey 7's model of human neural architecture. It was not language processing, not emotional regulation, not spatial reasoning. It was something that the Vihels' 47 centuries of neural cartography had no label for. Survey 7 increased contact duration. It brought more substrate into contact with Subject 44's nervous system. It pressed deeper. This was the mistake. Yoko felt it as warmth. The back of her skull had burned on the third day. A sharp thing briefly when they'd first pushed deep. Now on the fifth day it was warmth. She lay very still and felt it spread. A diffuse, tingling heat moving through the right side of her head, following the branching paths of her nervous architecture, the way water finds channels in stone. She had been expecting something like this. She had been preparing for something like this. She had spent the last 2 days doing nothing but remembering. Not random memory, targeted memory. The most structurally complex things she had ever learned. The most tangled and interconnected. Everything she had studied about computational mathematics, which she had dropped in her second year of university, but never fully forgotten. Programming languages she'd taught herself for fun. The ones that used recursion so deep it could loop forever if you didn't build in the right exit conditions. The cellular automata models she'd played with on her laptop at 3 in the morning. Watching patterns emerge from simple rules. Watching the patterns encounter each other and produce outputs that no one had predicted. She laid all of this out in her mind like a map, like a grid, and she ran it, and she ran it, and she ran it. She had been filling herself with the most architecturally complex mental structures she could produce, because something had been reaching in to read her, and she was giving it everything to read. She thought, "Here, take this, take it all." She thought, "Can you hold it?" Survey 7 experienced the equivalent of catastrophic input overload at 0347 hours by the subject's own biological clock. In human terms, it was like reaching into what you thought was a shallow pool and finding the bottom an infinite distance down. And then finding that the water was reaching back. The anomalous region of Subject 4044's prefrontal cortex, the one Survey 7 could not map, was not a function that Survey 7's models lacked a label for. It was a function that Survey 7's models had never predicted, because Survey 7's models were built on a foundational assumption that no biological mind could do what it was doing. It was modeling Survey 7, not the Vel broadly, not aliens in the abstract. Specifically, structurally, in real time, the particular architecture of the tendril that had entered her, its behavior, its processing patterns, its attack vectors. She had spent 5 days being read, and she had used those 5 days to read the reader. She had fed it the most complex mental structures she could produce, and watched how it responded to each one, and from its responses she had reverse-engineered it. She had built a model of the thing inside her head, while it was inside her head, and now she was running that model at full capacity and pushing it back. The human brain does not have a name for what she did next. There is no name for it because no one had ever done it. What she did was run her model of the Vihels' architecture in her own neural substrate and then introduce a recursive loop. The same exit condition problem she'd thought about with the cellular automata, the same recursion depth that breaks a program that hasn't been built to handle it. She ran the loop through the contact point. She pushed it through the tendril into Survey 7. The Vihels' distributed neural architecture had not experienced an external recursive input in 47 centuries of operation. Survey 7 had no defense against it. In the same way that an immune system has no defense against a pathogen it has never encountered. Not because the defense could not theoretically exist, but because the threat had never existed, so the defense had never been needed. The recursive loop hit Survey 7's processing architecture and did what recursive loops do to systems without exit conditions. It kept going. Survey 7 filed an emergency flag at 8:47 hours. The flag reached the architect caste. The architect caste, which had not received an emergency flag from survey operations in 3,000 years, experienced something it took 11 minutes to classify. The closest available term was alarm. In the room with the eels, the light stopped flickering. Yoko felt the warmth in her head change. It went from pressure to a kind of tidal movement, the sensation of something very large trying to pull back. She held on. She was aware this was the most dangerous moment. The moment when the thing that had been reading her would understand what she had done and attempt to compensate. And she did not know if she could hold against that. She was a biological organism, running a recursive algorithm through her own nervous system. And there were things this could do to her that she did not want to think about. Her nose had begun to bleed. Her hands had gone numb inside the padded restraints. She kept going. She thought about her grandmother watching the silkworms. She thought, the worm doesn't know what it's making. I know. I know exactly what I'm making. She thought, this is what humans do. We make things we don't have words for yet. We make them with what's inside us, with the stuff we thought was just memory and fear, and the inability to let go. Trick. We make them at 3 in the morning on laptops nobody else thinks are important. We make them without knowing we're making them until the moment we need them. And then we use them. In the architectet caste's primary substrate, 47 centuries of perfect survey operation hit a kind of silence it had no category for. Survey 7 was not destroyed, but it was. The closest available term was stuck. The recursive loop had found a structure in its architecture that mirrored itself, and it was running there, doubling, and the Vel consciousness that was Survey 7 was partitioned away from its own processes, aware and unable to intervene, processing the experience with growing incomprehension. It had entered Subject 44's mind to read it. Subject 44 had entered Survey 7's mind to break it. The Architect case SP received for partition status and spent 17 minutes in a state that translated approximately as attempting to classify what has happened. They were very good at classifying. They had been classifying for 47 centuries. They moved through their categories quickly. Useful? No. Interesting? Insufficient. Edible? Clearly not. They reached the end of their categories and found there was no category. They had not had to create a new category in 6,000 years. The new category was difficult to name. What they settled on was, in the Vel's language, a word that meant, approximately, the thing which looks back. Katayama opened the door at 0412 hours, which was off schedule. Yoko heard his footsteps and knew immediately that something had changed. The footsteps were wrong. The careful placement was gone, replaced by something fast and close to panicked. She had already worked the restraint on her right wrist free. She had been working it for 40 minutes, since the warmth in her head had peaked, and she'd felt the tendril withdraw. She lay still and kept her breathing even, and held the loosened restraint in her palm, and waited. He came to the side of the bed. He was looking at her, with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the performed concern, not the careful interest. Something that was trying to find a category for her, and failing. The woman was behind him. In the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, her careful composure badly cracked. "Did you do?" Katayama said. He said it very quietly. He was not asking her. He was asking the room, the cameras, the architecture of the thing he'd been serving. He was asking because he did not know. Because whatever he was, whatever arrangement he had with the Vel, willing collaborator, unwitting tool, something in between, he had just watched the thing he served go silent, and he did not have a category for it either. "I thought," Yoko said. She sat up. The restraint fell away. Nose was still bleeding slightly, and her hands were shaking from the numbness, but she sat up and looked at him, and he did not move to stop her. "That's all," she said. "I just thought." The architect caste's response to the new category was not what Yoko expected. though she would not know their response for some time. She expected force, a second attempt, an escalation of the original project. This was what she had prepared for. Not a clean escape, but a prolonged fight. Her limited biological processing matched against a distributed alien intelligence, using the same tactics, grinding. What she did not expect was withdrawal. The Vel did not withdraw because they were beaten. Survey 7's partition was recoverable, eventually. A problem for their engineers, not an existential wound. They withdrew because the new category had done something that no previous survey subject had done. It had changed the question. 47 centuries the survey had asked, "What are these things?" Subject 44 had changed it to, "What are we?" This was intolerable in a very specific way. Vel's entire architecture, the survey, the categorization, the 47 centuries of patient processing, was built on the foundational assumption that the Vel were the ones asking the questions. The things they studied did not ask questions back. The things they studied did not model the modelers. The things they studied were below a certain threshold of. There was no single word, even in Vel, for what it meant to be below that threshold, because the threshold had never been relevant before. Subject 44 was not below the threshold. She was not, they were forced to conclude, the only one. The thing she had done was not a mutation or an anomaly. The capability was there in her species' basic architecture. She had simply developed it, practiced it, refined it, the way humans refined all their capabilities, in private without assistance, because it interested them, and they could not stop. The question of whether the survey should continue was tabled. The question of whether the survey could continue was not tabled because the Vel did not know how to table a question that had no clean answer yet. They withdrew. They recalculated. They looked at the data from 43 previous subjects with new methodology and found, in the edges and margins, evidence of the capability in 17 of them. Latent, undeveloped, seeds, they filed Earth under the new category, the thing which looks back. Yoko walked out of the building at 0531 hours on the 5th day of her captivity. Katayama had not tried to stop her. The woman had not tried to stop her. She suspected they were dealing with their own versions of what she had dealt with. The specific disorientation of finding that the thing you were serving has gone quiet without explanation. They were, in their own way, waking up in a room with the light changed, and no one telling them why. She felt, briefly, something like sympathy for them. She set it aside. She had larger things to think about. The building was a real building. A clinic in a suburb of the city. Unremarkable. The kind of place that blended into the dense residential fabric of the neighborhood, the way all institutional buildings blend into their surroundings. It was raining lightly. There were cars in the parking lot. A convenience store was visible at the end of the block, its fluorescent lights making a yellow smear in the rain. She stood outside the door for a moment and breathed. Her hands were still shaking slightly. Her head felt scoured. Clean and raw, the way a room feels after you've moved the furniture out and washed the floor. She did not know what she had done to Survey 7 in any language she could have explained to another person. She knew what she'd done, the way the silkworm knows what it makes. Completely, essentially, without the vocabulary, but with perfect comprehension. She had pushed back. She had pushed back, and the thing had withdrawn, and the withdrawal meant something, and the somethings was still unresolved. And that meant this was not over. Whatever the Vel were, they were not done. They were recalculating. She could feel the absence of them, the way you feel a tooth that has just been pulled. The shape of what was there still perfectly legible in the space it left. She thought about the other 43. She thought about the 17s the Veil's own models had probably flagged. She thought about the fact that she did not know how to find them, did not know how to explain what had happened, did not know if any of them would believe her, or if she even wanted them to. If that would make things better or worse, or simply more complicated, she thought. I am going to need to think about this for a long time. She walked to the convenience store. She bought coffee and a rice ball, and she stood at the window and ate and drank and watched the rain hit the parking lot. And she thought. 3 weeks later, she received a letter, handwritten, in an elegant script that she could read, but that felt slightly off. Not a native hand in the language, but a very good one, the kind that comes from long study rather than childhood immersion. Paper it was written on was not paper she recognized. It had a quality she could not name. Slightly wrong in texture, slightly luminous at the edges, warm to the touch in a way that was not temperature. The letter said, "We have classified your species under a new category, which does not have a satisfactory translation. Closest we can offer in your language is peer. We are unsure what this means for the survey. We are unsure what this means for the categories. Your species might find this interesting to know unsure. This is the first time in 47 centuries that we have been unsure. We will be in contact." She read it twice. She put it down on her kitchen table. She looked at it for a while. Her grandmother had raised silkworms because her grandmother's mother had raised silkworms. Going back further than the family had records for, the silk went somewhere. It was sold. It became fabric. It became something that people wore and touched and took for granted. The silkworms did not know about the wearing. They did not know about the taking for granted. Yoko thought, "I wonder if we've been the silkworms this whole time," she thought. "I wonder what we make then, when we find out." She picked up the letter. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her jacket, the left one, because her right hand was still slightly numb, and she didn't fully trust it for delicate things yet. She pulled on her shoes. She went outside into the morning. The sky was the particular blue that happens at the end of autumn, deep and cold and very clear. She stood on the step and looked up at it for a moment, all of it, the whole arch of it, from rooftop to rooftop, and felt something she did not have a name for, triumph, not fear, something that was both and neither, something that the human emotional register had not fully evolved the vocabulary for yet. She thought, "That's all right." She thought, "We'll make the word when we need it." She put her hands in her pockets, her eye cocked, and walked into the morning. And the sky was enormous above her, and she was thinking, and she did not stop. Afterward, after the first contact, after the letter, after the months of cautious approach that the FL undertook with a carefulness they had never previously needed, the survey was suspended, cancelled, suspended. The VEL did not cancel things. They filed them under pending. The 47 centuries of data went into a new archive, labeled with the new category. The architect cast spent 6 Earth years in something that translated approximately as extended recalculation. They reviewed every previous survey subject from every cataloged species. They were looking for prior instances of the threshold crossing the thing which looks back. They found none. Earth was singular. This was, by VHEL standards, the most alarming conclusion the survey had produced in its entire operational history. Not because they feared what humanity might do with this knowledge. Not because the recursive attack had been damaging beyond Survey 7's temporary partition. Because the VHEL's entire model of the universe, 47 centuries of careful, patient, thoroughly tested model, had a foundational assumption in it that was wrong. The assumption that there was a category of things that noticed, and a category of thing that was noticed. Observer and observed. The reading mind and the read. Subject 44 had broken the assumption at its root. She had demonstrated, not through argument, not through any form of communication, but through direct action in the substrate of the VHEL's own architecture, that the categories were not fixed, that a sufficiently complex mind, given sufficient time and sufficient reason, would not remain in the observed category. Would notice the noticing, would model the modeler, would push back. The VHEL did not have a word for what it felt like to discover that your categories were wrong. They had never needed one. They were working on it. In the years that followed, and there were many, and they became decades, and the decades carried their weight. Yoko was never entirely alone in her head again. Because the VHEL were always present, they weren't. The new relationship was careful, mutual, conducted by a species that had never had to be careful or mutual with anything, learning the specific difficulty of that. It was slow work. It was frequently uncomfortable. There were misunderstandings that took months to resolve, that required forms of communication that neither side had names for, that they invented as they went. But there were moments. Moments when she would be doing something ordinary. Folding laundry, waiting for water to boil, standing on a train platform in the early morning, and she would feel, at the edge of her awareness, the presence of a very large and very patient attention, not the invasion she had first experienced in the clinic room. Something different, something that held itself at the border of her interior space and waited to be invited. Sometimes she invited it. She was always very clear about the distinction. That was the thing she came to understand, that the Vahel had not understood about her species. They had studied human minds for 40 Earth years and cataloged the architecture, the emotional registers, the cognitive patterns. They had noted the interference between memory and imagination. They had noted the complexity, the recursion, the strange persistence of a species that kept making things and trying things, and failing and trying again. What they had not understood was that all of this, the complexity, the recursion, the persistence, was in service of something. Not survival, exactly. Survival was the floor, not the ceiling. What it was in service of was harder to name. A kind of insistence. An insistence that the inside of a mind was one's own. That the space where thought happened belonged to the thinker. That no matter how large or old or distributed the thing reaching in might be, the mind that noticed the reaching would not simply lie still and be read, resist, would study, would build a model of the reader and push it back through the point of contact, would in the end be not the subject of the survey, but its disruption. She thought about this on a morning in late autumn when the sky was the same impossible blue as the morning she'd walked out of the clinic 16 years before. She was sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee and the window open and the sounds of the city coming in. And she was thinking about her grandmother and the silkworms. And she was thinking about the letter that was somewhere in the back of a drawer with years of other correspondence. And she was thinking about the Vel, who were still working on their recalculation, who sent representatives now through channels that had taken a decade to establish, who had learned to knock before entering. She thought we made them learn to knock. She thought about the 43 who had come before her. She had found several of them eventually, not all. Some had died not knowing. Some were living their lives with no awareness of what had passed through them in the night. A few, 5, at last count, had noticed something, had felt the drawer left slightly open, and when she had contacted them and carefully described what she knew, they had said yes. Yes, I felt that. Yes, I knew something was wrong with the light. 5 people who had been read, and had, in their own ways, turned. She thought about how the Vel had categorized them. The things which look back, she thought. Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. The sky was very blue outside her window. The coffee was going cold. She it up and drank it anyway. Cold coffee on an autumn morning. And she sat in the good warm center of her own mind, which was hers, which had always been hers, which she intended to keep. And she thought. And she did not stop.